That's what they're for. Israel's not defending itself from anyone. So it's pretty broad if you're serious about it. And if you want to have a real educational program that'll get people to understand what's going on in the world, including what their own countries are doing, which is always the most critical thing, because that's the thing you can influence. It's just got to be properly framed. And it easily causes a backlash. In fact, very often, broad BDS proposals have just strengthened jingoist elements who can point to the fact that, the element of hypocrisy in them and say, well, it's just anti-Semitism, we got to support Israel even more strongly. That's happened over and over. So when you implement a tactic, you have to think of its consequences. Now here, the South African analogy is often brought up, but that's worth thinking through. In South Africa, in the case of South Africa, there was finally a boycott, which was effective, but it was in the 80s, the 1980s. There had been an academic boycott, but it was extremely narrow. It was because of racist hiring. Okay, that makes sense. You can boycott a university for racist hiring practices. But it wasn't general. It wasn't about apartheid. It began late 70s, early 80s. But by the time the South African boycott took off, that was after decades of organizing and educating educational efforts, which had led to a stage where the population strongly accepted it. In fact, U.S. Congress was passing resolutions of a similar sort. President Reagan had to evade them in order to support apartheid South Africa, but he was evading congressional resolutions. Corporations were basically supporting it. They were supporting what was called the Sullivan Principle. You can't have discrimination in hiring. And there was, mayors of cities were getting arrested for protests and so on. Now, that's totally different from the situation here. That level of education and organizing has barely even begun, let alone been achieved. So if that's an analogy at all, what the analogy says is we got a lot of work to do before these proposals really become meaningful.
Okay. Norman Finkelstein has said that the public reaction to Jimmy Carter's book, Peace Not Apartheid, was quite positive. The public reaction to it, and
the public reaction to. I didn't quite understand. Public reaction to what?
Public reaction to Jimmy Carter's book. Was quite positive, and he said that he feels that this reflects a kind of broadening awareness in the American public about the conflict. Do you agree with this, and what do you think this kind of broadening consciousness means for the sort of future?
Well, actually, he's got a lot of experience and a lot of insight. He travels around the country a lot, gives a lot of talks, and can see things changing. And I do too. It's been very clear. The reaction to Carter's book was instructive. He's right. It had kind of a popular resonance. In fact, it was a bestseller. On the other hand, it was utterly lambasted in the mainstream.
Yeah, we have a quote actually from Alan Dershowitz, who said that there is a special place in hell reserved for Jimmy Carter. Just to give you an instance.
Alan Dershowitz is not. Citing Alan Dershowitz is like citing some ultra-Stalinist Stalin period. It's just meaningless.
Right,
so, for example, Dershowitz, one of his latest gems is during the Gaza war, he wrote an article in the Miami Herald in which he said, this is the purest example of a war between pure magnificence and pure evil through the 20th century. So, like, more than the war against the Nazis. I mean, he's kind of off the wall. There's no point discussing it. But although it's kind of interesting that it's tolerated in the United States, which tells you something about the intellectual climate. If anybody said that of any other topic, they'd be utterly ridiculed. In Europe, they'd probably be thrown in jail for hate speech or something. But the point is right. I mean, the intellectual community did condemn the book pretty harshly. There's very little praise for it. But the population is what Norman Finkelstein said. It tended to support it. The reaction is quite interesting. I mean, Carter's book was pretty conventional, actually, for anybody who's familiar with conflict. But in the American intellectual community, it's like a bombshell because you're not allowed to say those things. There was one novel part of the book, important novel part. I mentioned that Israel had rejected the roadmap instantly. It had issued 14 reservations, which essentially eliminated its content. That was suppressed here. In fact, Carter's book was the first time anywhere near the mainstream that it was mentioned, and mentioned prominently. He had an appendix in which he listed the reservations. I didn't see a single commentator even refer to that, the one novelty. There was a tremendous effort by Dershowitz and even sane people to try to find errors in the book. So, did he get a footnote wrong or something? Well, in fact, there was one glaring error in the book which nobody mentioned. He accepted the standard propaganda line that when Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, it's its most extreme crime to date, killing 20,000 people. It did it in defense against Palestinian rocketing of the Galilee. Okay, that's the party line. It's flatly false. I mean, in fact, Israel was bombing Lebanon, trying to elicit a response, and failed, and finally invaded. And the invasion was pretty openly described in Israel as a war to ensure Israeli control of the West Bank, and nothing to do with rockets. But that is the party line, repeated over and over. Thomas Friedman, everybody writes about it, and Carter repeated it. Well, that's the one glaring error, but of course that wasn't mentioned. Going back to Finkelstein's main point, there's a striking shift in attitudes. I mean, I can just tell you from personal experience, like say 10 or 15 years ago, even right here at my own university, if I were to try to talk about these topics, I have to have police protection. Meetings would be broken up, screaming, hysteria, and so on. Same around the country. That's all gone. So give a talk now, hundreds of people show up, engaged, enthusiastic, can't even get a critical question. And that's true all over the country. And polls have shown that in the Jewish population, there's a kind of a generation split developing. Among younger Jews, they're finding it harder and harder to tolerate Israel's extreme violations of their generally liberal attitudes on things. So they're kind of drifting away or becoming quite critical. During the Gaza war, Congress and the press enthusiastically supported it, almost unanimously. Maybe they said it was disproportionate. It was about the harshest criticism you could get. But not the bloggers, especially the young ones. They were very critical and very sharp. And that, again, reflects the same split. Now, in the United States, public opinion has very little influence on policy. It's a formally democratic country, but there's a sharp split between public opinion and policy on a great many issues. And in fact, for a long time, the public has been in favor of the international consensus. So the Arab League plan was pretty strongly supported by the public, but rejected by the government. And it's an open question whether this change in attitudes that's very perceptible will influence policy. It's important to bear in mind that the media and the general intellectual culture typically stay very close to the government position, the kind of state corporate party line, if you want to call it that. Maybe a little deviation around the fringes, but not very much. The public is different. And here we reach the deep question of a serious democratic deficit. Public opinion is essentially ignored, not just on this topic, on topic after topic, including things very crucial to the public, domestic issues too.